Hi everyone, Danny here from the Joshua Tree, and thanks for joining us again. Well, COVID continues and the hairdressers are shut, so I've got my hat on, and we're at our final week on this little series looking at the book of Proverbs. And today we're going to be thinking about food and drink. Food and drink are just part of everyday life, but although they're quite ordinary, they can also touch on things that are quite sensitive. So I'm mindful that as we discuss alcohol, it can be scars that are deep for you or within your family or friends network. It can also be a source of great tension or struggle in the present. And food too can carry strong associations with how we look or how we feel about ourselves. There can be frustrations at what food we can or can't eat, or what it does to us with allergies. And so if we're talking about alcohol and we're talking about food and we're talking about what a relationship we have with it, I'm just wanting to flag that it could cause a range of different experiences within you. You see, both food and drink can have a sense of mastery or enslavement over us, whether it's the frequency or level with which we consume alcohol, or whether it's the array of diets that we've started in the past or have seemingly failed. And certainly in the midst of lockdown, both food and drink have really perpetuated their force on us. Many have enjoyed the time to be able to start cooking new things. It comes with the pressures of abundance and overindulgence. And so too, drinking is something that many have used to dull the pain or to cope with the boredom. So I just wanted to flag that there could be a whole range of different tangents that your mind takes as we start to discuss food and drink from the book of Proverbs. And what we've been doing in the book of Proverbs is seeing this underlying theme about crossroads moments, about the significance that particular decisions, seemingly ordinary and insignificant decisions, can have in charting the course of where we end up and ultimately who we become. And throughout the book of Proverbs, these crossroads moments often show the divergence between wisdom and foolishness, light and life, and darkness and death. And so these moments are so key because they're formative. They're formative for who we are and who we become, and they are formative about how we relate to God. God is keenly concerned with what happens in these moments. He's deeply concerned to be involved in our decision-making paradigm. And so today, as we think about food and drink, something that we all know about, we're going to see again that there are deeper things going on. And that's not really a surprise to us. We know that we have a celebratory drink when there's an occasion that we want to rejoice in. We often know that food can be a means of rewarding ourselves on the end of some great trial, or that it can be a form of comforting ourselves in the midst of disappointment, or something by which we drown our sorrows through. And now these occasions are quite obvious to recognise that there's a deeper thing that we're looking for as we eat something or as we drink. But what is probably more subtle is our wider ongoing relationship that we have with food and drink. So not just those sort of occasional occurrences or the current fad, but what is your broader pattern of relating with food and drink? Now, our first goal today is to try and understand what our personal relationship is. Secondly, we're going to hopefully consider what God's design for food and drink is. And then the third outcome for today is that we might be able to consider how we might reshape our relationship with food and drink in light of God's purposes for it. Now, whilst those are three goals that we hope to achieve in our time together, they're not going to be the way that this message is structured. We've been spending time meditating on these words of wisdom, these proverbs in the wisdom literature of this Old Testament book. And so we're going to begin our time looking at Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1. Wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Now here we get a picture of alcohol personified. Personified in these behaviours that are often associated with an overconsumption of it. A mocker, it's someone who undermines authority, who becomes a nuisance, who becomes a hindrance to those around them or within the organisation they're a part of. And a brawler, someone who assumes authority, usually through aggression, ferocity or physical strength. And now, whilst these two personifications are of the extreme, we can also probably relate to the moderate expression of them. When it comes to alcohol, many people are familiar with the idea of Dutch courage, just allowing alcohol to take the edge off so that you can say the thing that you wouldn't normally say or do the thing that you might normally have reservations about. And so we know that alcohol has this sense of handing over control, that we sort of lose our inhibitions, whether it's temporarily or habitually. Alcohol has this effect. Now we need to be aware of how dangerous the occasional can become the habitual. And many of us will interact with alcohol from our younger years, and we interact with it in what some of us might perceive as positive ways, but also have negative experiences. But there is a consequence for each of those interactions, and there is a real danger of progression in being led astray by the substance. Now, for many, we sort of laugh off these initial encounters with alcohol as just harmless. Often people will sort of even say the phrase, we'll just see where the night takes us. But there's a trajectory if we continue to allow substance to lead us. We can so easily be led astray. And so Ed Welch, as a Christian counsellor, talks about the descent into addiction, and he talks about it as a progression from initial rebellion, which I guess we could characterise with many young people's interactions with alcohol. It's just a bit of fun, we're going to have a good time. But it can eventually progress into something more controlling. And now, as we consider this progression, we're also mindful that there's a whole range of other substances that can have the effect of us losing ourselves, that we can give ourselves to, and the path for that can be very, very damaging. But today we're just going to be thinking about alcohol, because alcohol in and of itself is just a drink until we give it more power over us in terms of the quantity that we consume or the frequency with which we relate to it. But we can also grow in dependence on it. Dependence for the thing that we are ultimately wanting to find from it. And so there's a number of ways in which this proverb comes to light, in which we are led astray by alcohol. There is a danger that lies in relating to alcohol in a way in which we give it power, where we hand control to it, where we allow it to change our outlook and behaviour on life. And so we see in Proverbs 21:17, whoever loves pleasure will become poor, whoever loves wine and olive oil will never be rich. Here again, we start to get an insight on what it is we might be looking for from both food and drink. And here it's this sense of pleasure. And certainly anyone who's drunk quality wine or other alcohol can testify that there is a delight in the taste. And most of us know that if you soak anything in olive oil and fry it up, it tastes delicious. But what we see here in Proverbs 21:17 is that there is actually a battle for affections, for our affections, as we decide on the quantity and the degree with which we consume food and drink. You see, there's a great tendency to pursue pleasure, to live for the moment, to experience something that is satisfying. And here there's the illusion of the trade-off that takes place in that decision. To trade off your future prospects, in this case it's sort of the ability to accrue resources, material resources, for the broader experience in the present. Now there's a sense that when we eat and drink, we're making a decision. There's an opportunity cost. To buy the food or to consume all the food, it means that we've chosen not to do alternatives with it, which is to share it with others or to not have bought it in the first place. And so here is this bigger idea that what we eat and drink comes at a cost. Now all of us, no doubt, who have some sort of budget or sense of where our spending goes, go, of course, food isn't free. I can tell you exactly how much I spend on food and drink. But I don't think here is really just talking about the financial implications of our eating and drinking decisions. Now certainly there's an increasing awareness of the health implications that our choice of food and drink have on our body. But there's also moral and character implications for the way that we relate to food and drink. And particularly if we think of alcohol. At that point we're choosing at what degree we're going to allow a substance to shape our perceptions of reality and have an impact on our character. If alcohol becomes the thing that is our go-to when we need courage, whether it's the courage to deal with social anxiety or a bit of a fractious family relationship, whether it's what we need to speak our mind honestly or to have respite from the pressures that we experience in life, or the only means by which we comfort and soothe ourselves in the midst of disappointment, then this substance starts to come at a great cost. We start to increase its value. It moves from something that is an optional aspect of our life to something that becomes more necessary for our existence. And so to use food or drink to deal with the various tensions of life ultimately comes at the cost of allowing God to meet us in those moments. To ask how He might be guiding us, to actually experience how He might equip us or bless us to navigate these particular tensions that we feel. Again, it's about these crossroads moments. And we see this played out from Proverbs 23:19. Listen, my son, and be wise, and set your heart on the right path. Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. What we see here is that in these moments of our interacting with food and drink, we have a decision. It's a decision about how we're going to align our behaviour in relation to these substances. And it's really a question of whether we'll align ourselves as others are, or whether we will align and associate with them, or whether we'll align ourselves with how God desires us to relate to these things. Now remember, it's not about disassociating ourselves with others. Jesus himself was recognized as someone who associated with those who drank too much and ate too much. But here we see the importance of being aware of our actions and being able to differentiate ourselves from those around us. And now again, if we think about the consequences of drunkenness, it won't always mean that you're materially poor, although the more you spend on alcohol, the less you have to spend elsewhere. But there's a whole range of poverty that can result from it. And many families have been torn apart, are relationally poor because of the way that people have related with alcohol. Families, friendships become broken. This sense of drowsiness in your outlook on life, a lack of clarity, both in the immediate situations that you're in, but also in that broader spectrum of your life. Relationally become quite shallow. I guess we've all hopefully had the experience of being the sober one amongst those who are inebriated. And after a while, you sort of realise that the conversation is just sort of going in circles and not really going anywhere of substance. And the thing, as we give over control in a more ongoing way to alcohol, is that increasingly we become less self-aware and unable to discern the effect that our decisions are having on others. And now, alcohol perhaps is the more obvious thing to assess. But we see here that gluttony, the excess of food, also has an impact on us. Now, gluttony has the idea of thoughtlessness, rashness, and excess. And I guess for most of us, we would associate that with an overconsumption. To be a glutton is to just eat too much. But there's also this idea of being overly selective. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his great book Screwtape Letters, talks about gluttony. And he talks about these two categories, the gluttony of excess, the overconsumption, but also the gluttony of delicacy, about being overly selective in the foods that we eat. And so that really resonates with our wider society today, where people can become overly obsessed with the particular kinds of food, about having food that's originated from particular means or through particular sources. And now don't get me wrong, it's actually very positive that we are increasingly aware of where our food comes from, about the process by which food is sourced, the impact and the ethical framework for those who are involved in the growing and the producing of food. But excess insensitivity can easily flow, and we see it in our society where there's an obsession with how our food looks, whether we got it from the most fashionable source or whether we're eating it in the right place. The danger of gluttony is something that is prevalent in the Western world with our material wealth. Instagram itself really perpetuates this link between what you eat and who you are. You know, that you eat food that creates this healthy and beautiful look, or that you eat food that solidifies your place within a social group, or the food that you eat shows that you have great self-control, or that you're really out there, or that you're very principled in character. We can become poor in a whole range of ways when we become overly selective in our relationship with food. We can also become financially poor if we start buying food that we can't afford, eating at places that are too expensive. And there's a danger that foolishness in our decision making with food, in trying to shape our identity around the things that we eat, can actually lead us very, very poor. And so again, as we're in these decision-making moments about how we relate to food and drink, We're reminded of the things that we looked at last week around self-control. What's going on in our heart? What is it we most deeply desire? What is it that we value? Are our actions resonating with that? Now, it'll probably be no surprise for you that self-control looks like moderation in our consumption of food and drink. There's nothing probably profound in that for you listening today. But what actually is the kind of moderation that is sustainable? Because although we all know it in our head that moderation is the best policy, actually executing it is tougher than said. And so Proverbs 21 verse 20 says, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down." There's a sense that moderation here is about knowing the time and about relating to food in a way that is measured. I remember, growing up when I used to get a soft drink or juice or eat Milo, I'd just scull it down, and my dad used to always say, "You better not drink beer like that, son. That'll be dangerous." And there's a sense that when we understand that there are good purposes for food, being together, to sustain us, to celebrate with others, and just to appreciate the good things of life, that we would take the time to appreciate the moment, that we would be slow eaters. But there's a sense that when we are in a haste in our relationship with food and drink, that we're seeing it just as a means to a greater end. And so moderation isn't just in taking our time as we interact with food and drink, but it's also about being aware of the quantity that we are consuming. Proverbs 25:16. "If you find honey, eat just enough. Too much of it and you'll vomit." Now, any parent would know that as they talk to their kids about sweet foods or good things, that, if I could just eat ice cream for breakfast, lunch and dinner, that's not going to end up so well with you. The story of Cadbury employees down in Hobart, that as they join the factory, they're able to eat as much chocolate as they want, so that after a couple of weeks, they're actually sick of it, and so they won't steal it going forward. There's a sense that being able to learn to appreciate food in moderate portions is the pathway to having a healthy relationship with it. Learning to savour food. This is what it means to actually be satisfied. And so as we think about moderation, we're aware that although in our theory it's easy, in practice it's difficult, that we need to beware of excess, of when food and drink can quickly or slowly grow in consuming us. And I think it's right to say that perhaps for many, lockdown has been a situation that has snowballed and distorted an unhealthy relationship with food and drink. Which is where I think Proverbs 23 from verse 29 in a poetic form actually gives us a helpful insight. "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes?" There's a sense that the broad spectrum of the things that might be happening behind closed doors in the midst of lockdown, that the levels of despair and hurt and pain that come from an excess of both food and drink are captured here. Verse 30, "Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. Do not gaze at wine when it's red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly." Here there's a sense of the danger that alcohol has. There's an appeal to it, that there is some beauty that draws towards us, the taste, the initial effect, the ongoing sense of it transporting us out of our reality. These phrases around drinking in lockdown, wine o'clock, having a quarantini, and the pushes on Dan Murphy's as another lockdowns are announced. Alcohol becoming a coping mechanism. But verse 32 shows the consequences. Although it's been so appealing, in the end it bites like a snake and poisons like viper. And anyone who's had alcohol at any level of excess can talk about the hangover the next day, how your body feels. At other levels, the regret that you have over things that you said or things that you can't remember as you're consumed by substance. And so here we see this play, that the very substance that in many ways feels like it's giving you life, allowing you to be the person that you feel inhibited by other anxieties to actually be, is actually the very thing that can be killing you. The thing that makes you feel alive is the very thing that at the same time is destroying you. Verse 33, your eyes will see strange sights and your mind will imagine confusing things. You'll be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. They hit me, you'll say, but I'm not hurt. They beat me, but I don't feel it. When will I wake up so I can find another drink? Now, as pubs and clubs open up and as curfews are no longer a part of it, this might well just characterise what's happening on Sydney streets in the months that are coming. You see, alcohol can be so easily deceptive, and we need to be aware of how addictive it can become. When we give control to a substance, we've got to realise that that is foolishness at best, and it can end up in addiction at worst. This is something that we shouldn't take lightly. And so, how would God be wanting to reframe our relationship to both food and drink? Well, in Ephesians chapter 5, as we sort of see the outflow of a life in trusting in who God is, being united to Him through the person and work of Jesus, we hear this instruction about the outflow in our life. It says, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise. Again, it's the crossroad. And making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. It's about being intentional with our decisions. And so one of the things that some of us have been looking at this year is this book, Meal with Jesus. It sort of traces the way that Jesus interacted with food and drink. And now we saw earlier that reference that many thought that he was friends of gluttons and drunkards, and so he too must have been that. But we see in Luke's Gospel that Jesus relates to food as a gift. It's a manifestation of God's grace. And it's also the means by which we relate. It's a conduit for community. Think about these picnics that people are having. Thinking about the social events that you're looking forward to planning over the coming weeks and months. Being with others, eating and sharing with one another. And we also see that food and drink are key aspects by which God's mission to the world of people seeing who He is and seeing the transformative effect that He has on individuals' lives and His offering to them can have in this world. That's a proactive view of food and drink. And so it's not that food and drink is something that we're to be scared of. It's God's gift. It's the fuel that we have to live. And so it's crippling to try and see food as something that we need to avoid, that it's something that is evil. It is a good gift that we can delight in, and that we need to have a healthy relationship with what kinds of foods sustain us with the kind of energy that we need to do good. And so it can be thankful, something that we're thankful for. But we need to be careful that it's not something that we indulge in. And so the outlook is about being careful. It's about being wise. It's about being able to reassess what our actual relationship with food and drink is, and to make decisions to realign our behaviour with our values. If going to the bottle is your mechanism of dealing with disappointment or despair, then what would it look like to deal with your disappointment in a different way? To write out a lament or a complaint towards God about how you're feeling, about being able to share that burden with another. To not just allow your disappointment to spiral into something that alcohol is the only comfort that you know. You see, we see here that God is wanting to fill us with what is lacking. And that is the very same offer that the pantry and fridge door are offering to us when we go to them to deal with our disappointment, when we go to them to provide comfort. As we open those doors, we are closing the door on what God has offered to fill us with Himself, with His Spirit, for us to actually experience the kind of intimacy that He has made possible. So let's return to those 3 goals. As you've been starting to consider food and drink, gluttony and drunkenness, how are you relating to food and drink? What's actually happening? In what ways are you allowing them to lead you? What does moderation in the frequency and also the volume that you are consuming and interacting with them look like? Is there a place for realignment? What does it look like to be careful? And how might you go towards God and allow Him to fill you up at those times and occasions when you've previously been going to the pantry or the fridge door? Friends, God promises to be equipping us for the good works that He's prepared in advance. He is offering an intimacy with Himself to navigate these difficult crossroads moments. And that as we draw near to Him, as we seek His will, we walk down the path of wisdom. And that we can appreciate the good things that He's given, like food and drink, in a way in which we're not handing control of ourselves over to them, but that we are able to appreciate them as gift and give glory and honor to the one who gives them.